I was in a weird push-pull because I felt a loyalty to Valerie. I felt a disgust toward her, and I was terrified of her, all at the same time. There was a part of me that still wanted the sunshine and daisies piece of the relationship to have been real, which was that she took me under her wing because she thought I was special and she thought I was going to be this like great clinician, and she was trusting me with all her personal stuff. And as inappropriate as all of that was, it felt good. So part of me was still attached to that. I didn't want to betray her. I didn't want to be up in front of one of the mental health boards in the state as a client because that's embarrassing. And I wrote the meekest, most nuanced complaint, and I sent it in.
I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. This week, we're continuing Halina's story. If you haven't listened to the last episode yet, I'd strongly recommend starting there to make sure you're all caught up. When we left off last time, Halina had just submitted a formal board complaint against the psychologist she had been seeing, who we'll call Valerie. Halina was nervous about the whole thing and had kind of been pressured into it, so her complaint was very timid. She watered down all the ways Valerie had blown past boundaries, the ways their dynamic had come to look less like therapy and more like a very strange friendship. A friendship that had really made Halina deeply uncomfortable. While she waited to hear back about next steps, Halina decided to read up as much as she could about the board in her state and how it functioned. Not only did this give her a sense of what she could expect, but as many anxious people will tell you, deep dive research can be a great coping mechanism when you really don't know what else to do.
So I sent in the complaint and I started researching how this stuff is supposed to go. Over the weeks that poured by, I think it was a few months, I realized just how much of a disservice that I was doing by just letting this really meek complaint sit there that made it seem like the only thing that she did wrong was drink in session. I was like, oh gosh, she's going to come after me, because I was listening to these other complaints and some of these therapists were really going at it with the clients, and I'm going to be humiliated. And all because the board doesn't have all the information that they need. So I actually listened to a few meetings. I found a defense attorney actually who appeared a few times in front of that board. I called him up and I was like, hey, this is the situation. I'm really new at my career. I don't want to be humiliated. These are the things that happened to me with this therapist. And as he listened, his jaw got progressively lower to the floor. And he was like, this woman shouldn't be practicing. The complaint got scheduled to be heard. And the way that it works with the psych board in Arizona is you have up to 3 different meetings that they go through for each level of seriousness with the complaint. Now, other boards don't do that. The behavioral health board only sees somebody, I believe, like once, maybe twice. But the board investigator, who's not an attorney or a therapist, will read the materials, sometimes interview the parties, go through all those things. I never got interviewed or anything like that, which I was surprised about because the therapist was so off. But whatever, I guess they had their hands full. So we start going through the meeting process, and that's where the big reveal was that her defense wasn't, I had a lapse of judgment or this, that, or the other. Her singular defense was the client was borderline and she made me do it.
We touched on this a little bit in the last episode, but it's worth repeating just how common this is. Borderline personality disorder is a legit diagnosis that can sometimes call for intensive care. But it's also infamously tricky to understand. That murkiness makes it easy to toss around the BPD label as a buzzword that invalidates the client's experience. And this is especially common with female clients. It's frightening how rampant this is and how many people never hear the word borderline in their treatment until the therapist is on the defensive and decides to trot it out as a way to scapegoat them. Quick side note here. In the course of this work, I have also met individuals who embrace a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, some of whom have even gone on to win ethical complaints against their therapist. Our focus here is to emphasize the heavy stigma surrounding this disorder. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, the podcast Psychology in Seattle with Dr. Kirk Honda, who is also the founder of the Clients Harmed by Therapy group on Facebook, does an excellent job at compassionately breaking down the clinical characteristics of borderline. But back to Halina. Far too often that big scary word, borderline, it's enough to deter ethics boards. Instead of asking the clinician about their diagnostic criteria, they take the diagnosis at face value, even if it was applied retroactively, and decide that the client is an unreliable narrator of their own experience. But the attorney Halina reached out to helped her pull together as much documentation as possible, and she sent a more robust file to the board to supplement her complaint. And all that information was enough to help them see past the diagnostic red herring. Valerie was playing the part of a boy who cried borderline, and they chastised her for wielding the diagnosis so defensively and inappropriately. They also decided that all of Halina's evidence, the aggressive late-night texts, the alcohol, the sessions at Valerie's home, was enough to move the complaint to the next stage. And that's a good thing. But the meeting was still profoundly disruptive for Halina.
I come away from meeting number one learning that that was her defense. And at this point, I would laugh it out of the room because this is the amount of years I've been away from the situation. But when you hear someone who you trusted, who you thought valued you and cared about you and respected you as off as they are, when she decided to eviscerate my character like that, even though they called her out for it, it was one of the most profoundly humiliating experiences of my life. I didn't know which way was up. I wondered if she'd been BSing me the whole time, that maybe I really did have that. And then I stepped back and I checked the facts and I'm like, that's not me. But also, these are public meetings. And yeah, they don't say someone's name, but we're all on Zoom and people can see who's who. And it's a small community. So I went back to the attorney. We put in a lot more documentation and I kind of went into fight mode. And I was here, all of these things. I subpoenaed my records. There were session notes for things that never happened. One of them, she said that I had talked about some disastrous situation about a poor relationship at work at a time when I didn't even have that job yet, right? So it was 2 months before I'd even gotten the job. There was another time that she had said that I had done something else super weird. I don't remember what the thing was, but I wasn't even in town. I sent them a receipt from the Cheesecake Factory in San Diego for the same night.
Do you hear how hard she had to work just to make sure her story was taken seriously? The defensive tactics of unethical therapists, like weaponizing a diagnosis or retroactively falsifying notes, are bolstered by the fact that they are often inherently seen as the authority in the room, while the client, on the other hand, is seen as the unreliable one. They were in therapy, after all. The lack of widespread standardized practice makes things even trickier. Rules and norms can vary wildly from board to board and state to state, and it can take a whole lot of vigilance to navigate the system in a way that lets your story be heard. Halina's own experience helped her know what to look for, and her admirable hustle to research board practices and accumulate as much evidence as possible certainly made a difference. Without her doing all that, who knows how the board would have handled her case. It's important for a client who's been harmed to remember, during the complaint process, therapists receive substantial support. They're provided with an attorney and multiple opportunities for mediation. The therapist is allowed to respond to your complaint, and in most cases, their responses remain confidential, meaning you won't know what they've said or even have the chance to respond. Far too often, when clients don't jump through all the right hoops to make sure they're taken seriously, ethics boards just find it easier to defer to the perceived authority of the clinician.
Some therapists will use an electronic health record, which does timestamp notes. Some people still write them either by hand or in Word, which doesn't. And there are other reasons to not use an electronic health record for some or all of your work. a lot of the electronic health records make you put your notes in a certain format that for some therapists just doesn't make sense. Now, this therapist, I think she was just creating notes whole cloth. And by writing them in Word, she didn't have to put a timestamp on it because Word doesn't log the time that you write things. If someone does have time-stamped notes, it can provide a bit of protection and accountability. But the thing is, I just want to say to your listeners, when you go into a therapy situation, there's no reason for you to walk in thinking that you have to protect yourself, right? At this point, I do keep contemporaneous notes when I go to therapy myself because I find it helpful to me to kind of know where I was, what my mental state was, how I showed up to session, the things I'd worked on, because I find that helpful. But if I were going to therapy, documenting my own sessions because I'm scared I can't trust the therapist, I don't know that I'm going to get that much growth out of the therapy. It's this weird catch-22 that if you are so on guard and so, for lack of a better word, paranoid or jumpy or averse, you're not going to be able to get much out of the situation anyway because your nervous system is going to be so activated. But I would say that a good way to protect yourself is keep your own notes. If anything weird happens in session, try to commemorate it to yourself by writing it down, or if there's any way to email the clinician about it or send something through the portal that says, hey, when you said such and such, that was a really interesting thing for me to go home and think about. Even if you're not ready to say, hey, when you said such and such, it really freaked me out and it really wasn't appropriate. Just make sure to get it on record somehow. And I know that it's hard to say after the fact, and nobody should beat themselves up if they didn't do something protective like that. But I think what's hard is when it comes to notes, usually the only person in the room that has notes is the clinician. And in my situation, I think there was just so much wrong with what this therapist did that the fact that she put notes in there for sessions that I either didn't even attend or for incidents that never happened that I verifiably proved I wasn't there or never happened, those were small potatoes in comparison to some of the rest of her behavior. But I think most boards would see something like that, see it as someone committing fraud and yank their license. So I would look at session notes with as much scrutiny as possible. If you're planning to send in a complaint, check your own timelines for your life. Because if I hadn't looked with such scrutiny, I might not have caught that certain things were fabricated. And not everybody has proof of everything that goes through. If a clinician writes notes that don't line up with your personal experiences, it might be helpful to even just name that at the board meeting or in the investigation. Just say, listen, in this context, the only person that has a paper record happens to be this clinician. And while I dispute that these things happened this way, I just want to name that I have no way of refuting this because the clients are not tasked with taking notes as well. And I wish that I did, but I wouldn't have known that I had to. Even saying that for yourself can be really, really empowering.
This is part of what makes Halina's voice such a powerful gift in talking about therapy harm. There's often a very wide chasm between unethical therapists and the clients they hurt. A huge disparity in expertise, power, perceived reliability. But because she's both a practitioner herself and someone who's been harmed as a client, Halina can help us pull back the curtain and get a clearer picture of how unethical therapists function and how they often avoid accountability. Her story of harm also helps her offer more holistic care to her own clients.
So to me, and maybe this is because I've been through a complaint situation, I am very careful about my notes. I don't talk crap about a client in notes. Even if a client comes in and says something to me that is shocking or personally upsetting or something like that, it's my responsibility to sit down with those things about a clinical consultant or my own therapist. That's my baggage, right? That's not on the client. I try to keep my notes as focused on growth and treatment and things like that as possible. So for example, if I have a client come in and tell me that they're debating whether to have an abortion, I'm not going to put that in the notes. I'm going to say client discussed a difficult medical situation, right? If a client comes in and says to me, I blew up at my 12-year-old because I had a long day and he was mouthing off, I'm not going to say client yelled at child. I'm going to say client talked about dynamics of parenting. I'm very, very almost sterile with my notes because the point of notes is you want to make sure that you kind of know what you've been doing to see whether it's working, to kind of make sure that the client's actually getting something out of therapy, which is part of ethics. And you want to make sure that you kind of have an idea of where you've been going, if you've kind of been looking at certain themes together. There's no reason to humiliate a client in notes because these things can be subpoenaed in any which way. And looking at it, I'm not taking notes to protect myself from the client. I'm taking notes because, number one, it's my ethical obligation under my license. But number two, I'm taking notes to make sure that I know how to continue treating the client well. I would never want my notes to come back and bite the client in some way. What if a really wonderful client is about to go through a divorce? Maybe there's nothing super awful about something that they shared, but in the hands of their divorce attorney could be really, really bad. I don't want that in there. And so I'm going to talk about what treatment method we used or what insights we talked about, or taught client this skill, or supported client in celebrating their win over an anxiety or something.
Of course, it should be standard practice to prioritize the client's best interest in even seemingly routine things like note-taking. But that kind of rigorous commitment to ethics is far from universal, and it's nearly impossible to enforce, especially when so many therapeutic institutions seem archaic or secretive. And when stories of therapy harm are told, it's often done so with skeptical or shameful whispers.
Board thing continued to progress. Every other month there was a meeting. So it was May, then July, then September. And finally at the September one, because it was so serious what happened, at each step of the way, they can either offer a discipline or carry it through to the next level. At the last one, they went through the statutes and the rules, and they found everything that was objectionable about what she did. And they could have come up with a lot more, I think. Her case was just so chaotic that they kind of stuck to the most salient things. It was really gratifying at the end when the motion was made for what to sanction her with. And they said that she had to get all of this extra supervision, and she had to learn how to do things differently, and she had to sort out her countertransference, which is essentially when the therapist's baggage kind of comes up and ultimately harms the relationship. They made this motion, somebody seconded it, and then they went board member to board member getting their vote. And they unanimously agreed that she had some really, really serious problems and needed some severe remediation. They didn't get everything into the board order that was supposed to be as per the recording, but there was enough there that I felt to some extent vindicated. I wish that they had put more in there about how it was so inappropriate for her to use a diagnosis as a defense, because they did say in the board order that it was inappropriate for her to use a diagnosis as a defense, but I wish they had specified, which was clear in the meetings, that it's not my diagnosis and that it doesn't fit me at all. But unfortunately, the way that it got transcribed into the board order was the client's diagnosis. God, it just salts the wound right at the end. But over time, you get a little better.
Part of what makes that false borderline diagnosis so excruciating is that it could easily describe Valerie's actions, not Halina's. Boundary crossing, manipulation, unreliability. Behaviors like these are often associated with BPD. But that oversimplifies a very complex diagnosis, and not everyone with BPD exhibits those behaviors. But in industry jargon, especially when a diagnosis is tossed around flippantly, borderline is almost always used as shorthand for some of the very issues that are the hallmarks of therapy harm. Because borderline personality disorder is both frequently misunderstood and heavily stigmatized, it becomes an appealing scapegoat for unethical therapists. In many cases, it allows the therapist to blame the client for their own bad behavior. So when clinicians are accused of harm and deploy the BPD diagnosis as a response, it's often essentially the mental health field's version of revenge porn.
The reason I think BPD is such an appealing one for a lot of these therapists to use when sort of trying to invalidate a client is that people think that borderline personality disorder makes someone's perceptions unreliable, which is essentially the fastest way to gaslight someone is to proclaim that they have a clinical situation that makes their perceptions hard to accept as truth. The idea that a person with BPD doesn't appraise situations accurately, or that a person with BPD, for example, thinks that they're being treated like they're special, or thinks that they're being treated with some kind of robust intensity that perhaps the therapist is saying, oh, I never did that. It must be the client. That was in the client's head. I think when it comes to the boundary issues in some of these situations, if the clinician can claim that it was the client's BPD, then it's a way for the clinician to escape their own accountability. In thinking about the pieces of BPD that are appealing for clinicians to use in their defense, there's something called splitting, which means that sometimes the person is on a pedestal and sometimes they're in the trash can. Sometimes you think that this clinician is brilliant, and sometimes you think that they are evil, right? An explanation that puts the blame on the shoulders of the client instead of the clinician is splitting. So if your feelings of being both drawn to and afraid of your therapist are because of something wrong with you instead of something wrong with them, it's the easiest way for them to explain away that experience.
The mental health field needs a very serious reckoning about BPD. It's one of the most commonly misdiagnosed mental health conditions. Part of the reason this occurs is because of the complexity of the disorder and the fact that many of the symptoms overlap with other conditions, like complex post-traumatic stress disorder, PMDD, ADHD, and ASD, or in the case of one of my family members, showing up in a state of crisis and being dysregulated was enough for her to receive the BPD diagnosis during her intake session. There needs to be more training for clinicians, more information for clients, and a whole lot more scrutiny when a diagnosis is wielded as a bludgeon. We also need to resist the notion that a borderline diagnosis automatically means that a client isn't a reliable witness to their own experience. Borderline clients deserve to have their stories heard and taken seriously as much as anyone else. And there should be very serious consequences when BPD, or any diagnosis really, is deployed incorrectly as a means of discrediting a client. Even in Halina's story, with all her expertise and vigilance, all the compelling evidence, the board didn't set the record straight about her false diagnosis. They chastised Valerie for weaponizing the diagnosis, but they didn't contradict it either. And that is still head and shoulders above how other boards have handled stories like this.
Watching the end of this meeting, as she sat there and heard everyone vote to memorialize the fact that she was just a terrible clinician, it was really gratifying. There were other pieces that were leaving as well, and they only keep the recordings on the website for a few years, but I saved them. And I don't listen to them as much anymore, but occasionally when I would get into a space where I would get a wave of shame or panic, or I ended up in a workshop with one of her friends, or I started to feel anxious about something that would trigger a memory of her, I would go straight back to those recordings of those board meetings, and I would listen to the one gentleman call her utterly unprofessional, and someone else saying, just stuttering over his synopsis of her behavior because he was so baffled and disgusted. 6 months to a year after all of this, having those recordings to kind of anchor to when I started to gaslight myself about it or started to feel embarrassed or uncomfortable, that gift was worth all of the crap that going through the complaint process had in it.
Halina realizes her story is far more rare than it should be. She knew the industry lingo, and she had studied up on board processes. And she put a mountain of work into her case. It also helped that Valerie's behavior, along with her efforts to cover her tracks, was so sloppy. Other therapists are usually more subtle or more adept at self-protection, along with the fact that other clients aren't nearly well as equipped to face such a daunting system.
I'm lucky that they did discipline her. And I think a lot of people do report horrible therapy experiences that unfortunately don't have as robust of a paper trail. Most people don't have text messages from their therapist justifying their alcohol use in session, for example. If the board throws your complaint out, and I'm saying this to complainants right now, people who've been through bad therapy, if the board throws your complaint out or they throw out chunks of it that you didn't have enough documentation for, it doesn't mean necessarily that they don't believe you. And it absolutely doesn't mean that these things didn't happen to you. It just means that they're not able to see it. And so I don't want anybody to think that just because they didn't get receipts from theirs, that their experience wasn't as real or that their pain isn't as salient. I just happen to be really grateful for the fact that I had these things to refer to. And if you do have documents, reporting what happened to you is probably a good idea. Now, no one should pressure you to do it. And I would advise that you check the statutes in your own state, because I could have waited 4 years here. And I wouldn't have done that because I didn't want people to be in harm's way. But was it healthy or safe for me to go writing this report a couple of days after it happened because my friend's supervisor pressured me? Probably not. That never should have happened either.
Even with the small amount of satisfaction at the end, it had really been a miserable and exhausting process. Halina hadn't even processed what she'd been through in therapy before she was pushed into the complaint proceedings. And now she had that much more to work through. So she decided to try meeting with someone else. And she would learn once again that no one in the know seemed surprised at all to learn of Valerie's misdeeds.
I went to a therapist after her to just try to get over some of the trauma, and I didn't even realize that they knew each other. And I was so scared to say who it was, and I didn't end up saying who it was. This therapist actually ended up listening to board meetings to try and figure it out. I'm not supposed to say the person's name, but there was a private settlement, and I can say that that happened. But because of that, I can't say her name publicly, but I can talk about what happened to me. Just the symbol of it, just kind of knowing that someone had to atone for what they did, was helpful. But this other therapist said, hey, I figured out who it was. Just so you know, a lot of us have had problems with her. A lot of us don't refer to her. We know that she's had problems for a very long time. Part of me felt relieved and validated, as that therapist intended, but the other part of me was so angry that these seasoned therapists in my city were just keeping this open secret that this woman is just totally unwell. And I don't know who could have reported and how. And this other therapist and I had a conversation about it. And I said to her, well, don't you feel uncomfortable that this woman is out there treating people? And she said, I personally never saw enough compelling evidence that going to the board felt like it would be helpful. And I don't know if that was a cop-out or if it was accurate, but just knowing that we know that there are really corrupt people out there and there's not much we can do about it. But if I see problems, damn well I'm going to be honest about it. And I'm absolutely going to say something if I see concerning issues.
Halina would learn of at least a dozen other therapists in the area who felt the same way about Valerie. We know she's dangerous. We don't refer to her. But there's not much else we can do. And so the open secret remains far more of a secret than it should.
As far as I know, she's still practicing. She came off of her disciplinary action. I think she had a year of supervision. And I don't know what she actually changed about her practice. I hope that she's more transparent in her records now. My fear was that instead of actually changing her harmful ways, she would just figure out how to cover them up better. But for my own sanity, I've kind of had to stop thinking about that. I know that her disciplinary order is on the state board website, and it's in a couple of other places online. And so if people really are looking to see whether a therapist has had a problem, at least that record is there. And I know that even though it doesn't have everything that it should in there, and they made that little error about client's diagnosis as opposed to diagnosis assigned to client or whatever it was. But I think what's hard is the majority of the public is not going to look that stuff up. They're going to look at someone's website, or they're going to hear someone do some public speaking, and they're not going to realize it. But my hope is that if she does hurt someone else and someone else starts feeling uncomfortable or gaslighted, they'll then look at the board website and be like, it wasn't just me.
This whole experience has given Halina vital perspective in her own work. And it helps her think differently about professional ethics, which are too often viewed in a remedial and fear-based way. Less about what's best for the client, and more about the clinician making sure that they don't get in trouble. She hopes the conversations around ethics can become much more robust, supportive, and ongoing. Not just a single class in grad school or a continuing ed seminar you only half pay attention to.
We have a situation in our field where even our ethics classes are very much, here's a vignette or a situation, a fake story. How would you handle this perfectly? And that's not how ethics works in real life. The way it works in real life is you've made a mistake. How do you fix it? Or your friend who's a clinician made a mistake and they come to you with it. How do you help them fix it? Or you've started down a path of bad boundaries or toxicity with a client. How do you right the ship? How do you own it? How do you move through so that you can stop the situation and not make it worse? Because we have this idea in our field that mistakes make a person immutably bad. And I would say that probably 9 out of 10 situations where clients are harmed, it's because of a clinician mistake that if they had better support, they could have at least mitigated. The 1 in 10 that are like probably utter sociopaths or people who are deeply, deeply disturbed, we can't do much about those. But the other 90%, people get harmed that way too. And I'd really like to see our field become a little more limber and a little bit more open to looking at its own flaws. I don't think it's that tall of an ask. We teach clients to do that all the time about being gentle with yourself and self-forgiveness and self-compassion. But when it comes to our field itself, everybody's afraid to look under the hood and see if they've done anything wrong because they're worried that it means there's something immutably bad about them. Most of us really just need to be able to identify our mistakes so that we can fix it. And I think if we had a field like that, everyone's brittleness would go away to the extent that the people who really, really are scary and problematic would look so much different than everyone else that maybe they would leave the field or maybe they get called out with better ease.
Sometimes in therapy harm circles, you hear people say, no one wants accountability for unethical therapists more than the ethical ones do. I think Halina is evidence of that. The unique perspective of clinicians like her could be vital in changing their field to address the ways it has failed too many clients. If you're one of those clients, and if the thought of returning to therapy is not something you can stomach, that's okay too. There are other ways to pursue healing.
You don't need to jump right back into therapy right away, if at all. Maybe your answer, maybe your comfort comes from good friends or a book club or going hiking or art classes. And I wish I could just wave a wand and get everyone the closure that they deserve from bad therapy experiences. But sometimes the best resource is just knowing that you have everything in you that you need to move forward. And it might be painful. You might get waves of doubt, things like that. But whatever that therapist took away from you, you don't need to go back to another therapist or our profession to get it returned.
By the way, remember why Halina sought out therapy in the first place? Well, she did end up finding the support she needed. And this last November, she gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby girl. Thank you so much to our guest today, Halina Brooke. If you'd like to reach out to Halina, you can do so at halina@recourscounseling.com. That's her private practice email. But this isn't a professional plug. It's just the best way to contact her. She said she'll be happy to talk as a friend and fellow survivor, and to lend whatever wisdom and support she can about therapy harm and the board complaint process. Thank you to the show's writer, Bo Detton. Your talent and perspective bring so much. And finally, thank you to our audio engineers, Peachtree Sound.